There are a lot of names for what we're making today, whether you call it a submarine or a hoagie or by its other names. Our goal today is to make a soft and fluffy bread to serve as the base of this famous sandwich. To be specific, we'll be looking at one of the most widespread versions of the sandwich, popularized by a famous fast food chain, one of the largest restaurant chains in the world. A quick online search reveals several ingredient lists for these breads, which vary by location and change over time due to consumer preferences, regulations, cost effectiveness, and ingredient availability. However, at their core, these ingredient lists offer interesting insights into commercial bread making. Looking through them, we see that aside from essential ingredients like wheat flour, water, yeast, salt, and sugar, several additives stand out: ascorbic acid, dextrose, vegetable emulsifiers, enzymes, and others. If you try to find out what these ingredients do, you'd quickly find that additives are, in a way, part of the secret to fast food bread, allowing companies to achieve perfectly consistent flavor and texture while keeping the bread fresh, extending its shelf life, and cutting down on production time. That wonderfully soft and light bread that you bite into, whether in a burger or sandwich, is the product of extensive research and ingredients that you probably don't keep at home. That's why I've always wondered, can we recreate it without them? Specifically, is ascorbic acid really necessary? What household ingredients can replace dextrose? What substitutes are available for vegetable emulsifiers? And of course, can we make it even tastier? Hey, I'm Seraphin. Today we'll dive into those questions and bake delicious sandwich rolls using household ingredients and a bit of food science. Now, before we get started, let's clear up a few things. First, it would be inaccurate to say we're simply replacing the additives with natural ingredients. These additives are often natural to begin with, so that's not exactly our goal. Why bother then? Well, a big motivation for me is that I find commercial fast food or supermarket bread often lacks flavor. Perhaps it's subjective, but it just feels off in many sensory aspects. That's why I generally prefer to bake my own bread. By baking our own bread, we can tweak practically everything for health reasons or personal preference. For example, we can reduce the sugar and salt or enhance the bread's natural flavor and texture using techniques like Tangzhong and Poolish. These are just a few of the many possibilities with home baking. In short, while we're inspired by that fast food bread, we're going for something even better with this recipe. We'll aim for similar basic characteristics: a soft crust, a fine and even crumb, a sweet and aromatic flavor, and more, but this will ultimately be a different bread with a better taste and a much simpler ingredients list. But to make our version of the bread, we need to fully understand what was going on with the original version of the bread. So let's start with this additive on the ingredient list: ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C, E300, is a common baking additive known for its various benefits. However, in many home baking scenarios, its effectiveness is minimal, and in some cases, it may even have a detrimental effect. While incredibly useful in large-scale bread production, it is generally unnecessary for home bakers. It is usually considered to be a reducing agent in food. In commercial baking, though, it functions as an indirect oxidizing agent. Its molecular structure, featuring highly reactive hydroxyl groups, allows it to react with oxygen, catalyzed by wheat flour's ascorbate enzyme, to form dehydroascorbic acid. DHA then oxidizes reduced glutathione, a natural antioxidant in wheat flour, to glutathione disulfide. This oxidation process prevents GSH from disrupting the gluten network through disulfide bond cleavage and glutenin depolymerization, ensuring optimal dough height and gas retention during fermentation. So for ascorbic acid to function effectively as a dough improver, it must be converted to DHA during mixing, a process requiring sufficient oxygen in the dough. In commercial bread production, this is not an issue due to high-intensity mixing, which incorporates abundant oxygen and a shorter overall bread-making process. However, home baking presents a different challenge. Slower mixing speeds, longer processing times, and especially hand kneading all reduce the oxygen available for ascorbic acid oxidation. In home baking, during mixing and the early stages of fermentation, yeast and wheat lipoxygenase rapidly consume oxygen. Studies suggest that approximately 70% of the oxygen in dough is depleted immediately after mixing. Once oxygen levels drop, the dough environment shifts from aerobic to anaerobic. The yeast can adapt to this and continue generating carbon dioxide, but the lack of oxygen prevents the ascorbic acid from oxidizing into DHA. When this happens, ascorbic acid retains its default role as a reducing agent, which can weaken the dough structure instead of strengthening it. Based on this explanation, it's clear that in many cases, ascorbic acid provides little to no benefit in home baking. Instead, by better understanding gluten development, we can enhance gas retention in dough through proper techniques to achieve an optimal strain hardening index. Of course, this may require a better understanding of the effects of hydration, mixing, and subsequent resting of the dough, which involve polymerization, depolymerization, and repolymerization of gluten components, as explained in our previous series of videos on this relevant subject. Additionally, rather than fast processing, a long, well-executed anaerobic fermentation promotes the formation of flavor precursors and other compounds, resulting in superior flavor and texture in the final bread. Bakers sometimes add ascorbic acid, wrongly assuming that it can turn their weak flour into strong flour. Well, you know that can't be true. Weak flour, such as all-purpose flour, has less protein. Adding ascorbic acid cannot raise the protein level to the level of, say, bread flour. Also, as an extra note, while some people might think it's just vitamin C, maybe it's good to add it anyway, it's important to understand that the health benefits of ascorbic acid in bread is not the same as the vitamin C found in fresh fruit. First of all, you only add a small amount of it, and then during baking, a significant portion of the ascorbic acid in the dough degrades due to heat. Its vitamin C benefits are largely lost. It won't provide the many beneficial micronutrients and complex bioflavonoids found in a fresh fruit's vitamin C. Furthermore, ascorbic acid may already be present in small amounts in your instant yeast packet, and if you purchase wheat flour in bulk, say in a 25-kilogram sack like this one shown here, it's often included in the flour. At least mine contains a small amount. So, in conclusion, it's a little pointless to add it to this recipe. Let's move on to the next additive, dextrose. Dextrose is a simple sugar and a specific aldohexose stereoisomer of glucose. While often used interchangeably with glucose, it represents a particular spatial arrangement of the glucose molecule. Through hydrolysis, a process that breaks down carbohydrates, glucose can be obtained from sources like lactose, sucrose, maltose, cellulose, and glycogen. Commercially, dextrose is typically produced from starches such as cornstarch in the US and Japan, potato and wheat starch in Europe, and tapioca starch in tropical regions. Glucose, and hence dextrose, as discussed in our earlier video on baker's yeast, is the primary sugar source for Saccharomyces cerevisiae, supporting its growth, energy production, and fermentation. Residual sugar left after yeast consumption contributes to the softening of the breadcrumb by weakening the gluten network, probably due to the competition for water, a crucial element in gluten development, as shown in our strain hardening series. This residual sugar also participates in the Maillard reaction, resulting in the characteristic browning of the crust and the development of complex bread flavors. In terms of sweetness, dextrose or glucose is approximately 75% as sweet as sucrose, while lactose is approximately 40% as sweet, and maltose is approximately 45% as sweet. According to the ingredient list that we mentioned, dextrose is sometimes added to the bread, as in this case, while other recipes only use sugar. Therefore, given its availability, we will use sugar as a substitute for dextrose in our recipe. This leads to the question, what amount of sugar is required to replace the dextrose? The exact dextrose content of this specific white bread is unknown, as it is not provided in the ingredient list. But if you remember a particular incident that went viral a few years back, Subway bread was deemed as not bread by Irish courts for containing 10% sugar per total flour weight, reportedly exceeding the limit by a factor of 5. The legal limit of sugar in that country should not exceed 2% of the flour weight for a baked food to be considered a bread, apparently. Now, Putting the legalities of sugar in bread aside, for our recipe, given that this is not a lean dough, I believe 2% sugar is insufficient in getting the bread characteristics that we want, and 10% is a bit excessive for my palate. Based on my experience with baking shokubang, in which sugar content is typically limited to approximately 6%, I'll use that as the lower limit, and we will also be relying on the subtle sweetness contributed by the Tangzhong or udane. However, this bread is not meant to be a shokubang bread, a milk bread, where the lactose of the milk also contributes to the sweetness. So I'm going to rely on a sugar range of 6 to 8% to achieve a suitable sweetness level. Due to that, we'll be using a slightly osmotolerant yeast. The suggested range of sugar is expected to provide satisfactory performance throughout the bread making process. To better understand the effects of sucrose on yeast, let's look at some scientific studies. One study found 2% sucrose to be optimal for yeast growth, while 6% and 10% inhibited it. Another study using commercial flour with adjusted diastatic activity showed that gas production remained constant in fermented dough up to 6% sucrose, then progressively decreased up to 12 to 15% sucrose. This latter study also demonstrated that adequate hydration can minimize the negative impact of higher sugar levels on yeast activity. Therefore, using the lower limits of our suggested sugar range, 6 to 8%, seems reasonable given the optimal dough hydration of 71% for a recipe using 20% udane, as shown in this study. Additionally, this same study indicates that we can expect an increase in saccharides and maltose during fermentation. All of this provides the basis for our choice of sugar level. Okay, let's go back to the ingredient list. What is this? Mono and diglycerides are emulsifiers, also known as E471, or as referred to in the company's other documentation, vegetable emulsifiers. You may also see other emulsifiers such as soy lecithin in previous ingredient list. Do we need emulsifiers for home bread making? Of course not. Bread has been made without added emulsifiers for a long time. And to add to that, in this recipe, we use Tangzhong or udane. While not technically an emulsifier, Tangzhong provides similar benefits, including a softer crumb structure, improved moisture retention, better resistance to staling, extended freshness, and a fluffier texture. Though Tangzhong doesn't offer all the advantages of emulsifiers, it effectively serves our needs in home baking. So how does this work? Starch Latinization is the core principle behind the Tangzhong method. In simple terms, here's what happens. With excess water and enough heat, around 65 degrees Celsius, starch granules in wheat flour swell, the crystalline and double helical structures within them break down, and in the later stages of this process, amylose leaches out of the granules, mixes with the surrounding water, and alters the mixture's viscosity. Eventually, the granule structure disintegrates, allowing the gelatinized starch to function as a thickening and gelling agent by trapping water molecules within its network. While amylose, the linear starch molecule, plays a role in this process, amylopectin, the branched starch molecule, is crucial for the swelling of the granules. It's the amylopectin that largely contributes to the increased viscosity and the formation of the gel-like structure, as its branched structure allows it to hold a significant amount of water. This resulting gelatinized starch acts as a hydrocolloid, meaning it can stabilize mixtures by trapping water and increasing viscosity, as we mentioned. Like most hydrocolloids, gelatinized starch primarily contributes to emulsion stability by slowing down droplet movement, further enhancing the texture and consistency of the final product. When gelatinized starch is incorporated into bread making, as demonstrated in this paper on udane bread, the gluten network becomes noticeably thicker and coarser. We can infer that parts of the gluten fibrils are coated by the incorporated gelatinized starch. Additionally, instead of being tightly packed together as in regular bread, the starch granules in udane bread are surrounded by starch gels. This altered starch and gluten structure significantly impacts the bread's texture and other characteristics. Now, let's build upon this foundation and examine what happens when we introduce another key ingredient, fat. Specifically, in this recipe, we'll be using butter, despite the ingredient list mentioning canola or palm oil. I've already made a video explaining the different effects of oils and fat on bread. It's an interesting topic that we've discussed in depth, so I won't repeat it here. Okay, with this new edition, we are stepping into a complex topic involving lipid-starch-protein interactions, a subject still under intensive study. For now, I'll simplify it and leave the more intricate aspects for another video. Butter is a dairy product composed primarily of butter fat and water with small amounts of protein and milk solids. It exists as a semi-solid emulsion at room temperature. Butter fat is mainly composed of triglycerides, which are esters derived from glycerol, and 3 fatty acids. The aliphatic tail of these fatty acids plays a crucial role in forming ternary lipid-starch-protein complexes in bread dough. There are 2 key interactions leading to these ternary complexes: lipid-starch interactions and protein-lipid interactions. Based on available research, I think it makes sense to infer that both the gelatinized starch added during bread making via the Tangzhong method and the starch in wheat flour that gelatinizes during baking could contribute to the formation of these complexes. In the lipid-starch interaction, amylose in wheat starch can form complexes with lipids from butter through non-covalent interactions such as hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic forces, and van der Waals forces. Amylose has a tightly packed helical structure, but gelatinization loosens it. According to this paper, spectroscopic studies indicate that the aliphatic chain of the lipid inserts into the amylose helix, while the fatty acid's carboxyl group remains exposed due to steric hindrance and electrostatic repulsions. This explains how lipids become trapped within starch molecules. On the protein-lipid interaction side, wheat proteins interact with the fatty acids in butter through hydrophobic and electrostatic interactions. These 2 interactions contribute to ternary complexes that may exhibit emulsifying effects, stabilizing interfaces within the dough throughout hydrophobic and electrostatic interactions. This could explain why Tangzhong or Udane enhances bread characteristics that resemble those achieved using commercial emulsifiers. Given all this, at least for home baking, I don't believe emulsifiers are necessary in bread made with Tangzhong or Udane. However, if you still want to use one, egg lecithin is a readily available option. That said, I personally don't see the need. Eggs help stabilize the gluten network, something that can be achieved through proper mixing and kneading, and they also add a savory note to the bread, which may not always be desirable. If you insist on incorporating lecithin, we can modify our recipe to include a whole egg. Keep in mind, though, that commercial ingredient lists primarily feature plant-based emulsifiers, while eggs are obviously not plant-based, and egg yolk lecithin may not work in the exact same way as many commercial emulsifiers. Now, while we're on a subject related to fat, I'd like to point out that I usually use about 6% baker's percentage of fat in most of our bread recipes. While fat may improve texture and softness through better gas retention, unless otherwise required by a specific recipe, I usually prefer not to use too much fat in a recipe due to this reference that shows the effect of fat on the texture and volume of the bread. For soft rolls like this one, we can use up to around 6 to 8%, and when it comes to the low volume, this graphic adapted from the reference shows 6% can still give us the highest volume. That's why 6%, give or take, is my upper limit, usually. There's another issue to consider when it comes to fat. Fat may coat the gluten and inhibit its development during mixing, so I tend to add the fat to the mixed dough after I see a sufficient amount of gluten development has already taken place. While other references suggest it might be unnecessary, knowing the potential detrimental effects of Tangzhong, I prefer to err on the side of caution. That's why I always add butter to the dough after some gluten development. Further down the ingredient list, enzymes are mentioned, though no specific enzymes are listed. Enzymes are essentially catalysts, substances that increase the rate of a chemical reaction without themselves undergoing any permanent chemical change. There are quite a number of endogenous enzymes in wheat flour. Given the right conditions and sufficient time, a small number of enzymes can participate in many reactions. They are not destroyed or transformed during the reactions that they help to speed up. They simply move on to the next one. In home baking, we carefully time our bread making process to take advantage of their activities that may enhance the quality of our bread, flavor, texture, and other sensory notes. Endogenous enzymes already in the wheat flour serve us very well. There is no need for any more additional enzymes. In summary, I'd like to say this: to use additives in home baking is actually very unusual if you think about it, because the purpose of many of these additives used in commercial baking is to make bread that tastes homemade or artisan in the sense of being properly fermented and well crafted. As home bakers, we don't need to take the shortcuts that additives provide because our bread making methods already provide us with natural ways to get the same, if not better results. Okay, let's get started in making our bread. All right, this recipe makes 5 soft and fluffy bread rolls. As we mentioned in the opening, all the ingredients are easily found. We are, though, using a somewhat osmotolerant yeast here that can handle between 5 to 10% sugar in the dough, baker's percentage. We also use some milk to glaze the dough before baking, but this is optional and you don't really need a glaze for this bread dough. Given the relatively high sugar content, it turns a lovely shade of golden brown by itself. As always, we start with making the Tangzhong and Poolish. Starting with the Tangzhong first, we have our flour already measured and a bowl on the scale. We'll pour the boiling water into the bowl, immediately adding the bread flour in after that. Using a spatula, we want to quickly mix the flour into the hot water. You'll see it form a thick gelatinous mass. This is exactly what we want. Now we just want to make sure that all the flour is incorporated. Do a quick temperature check. Then we'll clean the sides of the bowl and the spatula. And we cover the bowl tightly with a silicone cap to retain moisture. Make sure it doesn't dry out. We want it to cool to room temperature, then we can refrigerate it overnight. Now for the Poolish. In another bowl, we combine bread flour and our instant yeast, using the chopsticks to disperse the instant yeast before pouring in the water. Mix well until you have an even consistency. By adding the instant yeast to the flour first, we prevent it from being directly exposed to the water, which can actually harm the yeast during the rehydration process, so make sure to follow this step if you're using instant dry yeast. After mixing the Poolish together, our final ingredient is thyme, so we cover the bowl with a silicone cap and let it sit at room temperature for 1 hour before putting it into the fridge overnight. We want to use the Poolish right after it peaks, when it's gone down slightly, so make sure you see something like that before using the Poolish. Alright, when our Tangzhong and Poolish are ready after a night in the fridge, let's start making our bread dough. We'll be using a stand mixer for this recipe, given that this is a pretty sticky dough and can be very tricky to knead by hand. First, we'll uncover both the Tangzhong and the Poolish. You can see that the Poolish has risen up to touch the silicone cap and is very much done. Using the spatula to scoop it out, we add the Tangzhong into the stand-up mixer's bowl. Then take the Poolish, very airy, and again we're scraping it all into the main mixing bowl. You want every bit of it. Next, pour in the water. Sprinkling in the sugar after that, and then salt, getting it in with a quick shake. Finally, we add the remaining bread flour. At this point, I like to give everything a good mix with a spatula, creating a rough dough. This helps to prevent the flour from flying around in the mixer later, and it helps to break up the Tangzhong and Poolish a little bit. We also have the butter on the side, which we've already left out to soften. We'll be adding it to the dough later. Okay, we want to take the bowl to the stand mixer now, which already has a dough hook attached to it. We lock the bowl into place and start mixing on medium speed for about 3 to 4 minutes. You'll quickly notice the dough starting to come together, but it will still be quite rough. Don't be fooled by how dry it looks in the beginning. You don't want to add any water at this stage. As mentioned in the opening, we want the dough to go through some gluten development before adding the butter in. This should be visible by looking at the texture of the dough. It should be somewhat smoother compared to when we first started mixing it, and the entire dough should be wrapped around the dough hook. So after 3 to 4 minutes, we stop the mixer and toss in the softened butter. Using the spatula to get it all in. Then we lower the hook and turn the mixer back on, turning it to a medium speed, and we'll continue mixing for another 5 to 6 minutes. During this phase, the dough will initially look like it's falling apart due to the butter, but it will eventually come back together and become smooth. Keep an eye on the sides of the bowl and scrape down any stray pieces of dough or butter as needed. Nearing the end of mixing, the dough should look smoother and it should be wrapped around the dough hook. So we'll stop the mixer and take a small piece of dough to do a window pane test, gently stretching it out. If the dough can be stretched out thinly enough to see light passing through it without tearing, it passes the test. Due to the ingredients in this recipe like sugar and the use of Tangzhong, this dough does run on the weaker side, so it's normal if it doesn't feel very strong. That's alright as long as it looks cohesive, relatively smooth, and you can stretch it out like this. With that, since the dough is done with mixing, it's ready to rest. Using a bit of vegetable oil, we'll lightly line a large bowl, getting the sides, and we'll pour a little more onto our hands. Using a scraper, we scrape down the sides of the mixing bowl and take out the dough, getting every bit out. Setting the mixing bowl and scraper aside, we want to quickly round the dough in our hands, forming it into a smooth, round ball. Then we place it into the oiled bowl. We next want to cover the bowl and we'll let the dough rest for about an hour or until it has almost doubled in volume. The exact time will depend on your room temperature, so keep an eye on it. Then it's time to divide and pre-shape the dough. We start by uncovering the bowl, then we move it aside and remove the silicone mat before sprinkling the work surface with flour to prevent sticking. We'll also dust the top of the dough and use a scraper to loosen the sides. Finally, we flip it out onto the work surface. While pressing down into the dough and degassing it, we quickly shape the dough into a long log. This is to make dividing it more convenient. We've also got a scale on the side, which we'll use to weigh the entire dough so we can divide it accurately. Because we're making 5 rolls, we want to divide this log into 5 parts, just using the scraper. We'll weigh each piece and even out their weights, making sure that they're all the same size. After that, with a bit of flour to dust the work surface, we're going to make the dough pieces into round dough balls by tucking the edges into the center and rounding the dough out with our palms. Throughout this step, we want to make sure to properly degas the dough, putting in a bit of force to somewhat knead the dough while we pre-shape it. Then we simply make it nice and round using our palms. It's the same thing for all 5 dough balls, using flour to dust our hands and the dough as needed. This dough does get pretty sticky, so make sure to have enough flour on hand. And when we've got 5 pre-shaped dough balls, we're going to cover them and let them relax for 10 minutes, a quick bench rest. Once that's done, we uncover the dough balls and we're going to shape them into long rolls. With flour to dust the dough and the work surface, we're going to pick up a piece of the dough and first flatten it out with our palm, patting it down and fully degassing it, before using a rolling pin to stretch the dough out, forming a long oval shape. Again, the dough can get pretty sticky, so make sure to use flour as needed. You want to aim for a nice and long oval at this stage and pay extra attention to the edges of the dough because large bubbles tend to accumulate there. Then we want to pick up the dough and turn it around. We'll now try to stretch the dough into a rectangle, using the rolling pin to go over the dough again. Make sure it's an even layer and completely degassed. We'll also straighten out the sides of the dough so that it forms a neater rectangle. This helps to create an even and long bread roll. Following that, we roll the dough up like this, starting from the top and using our thumbs to really tuck the dough into itself. Super simple shaping technique here, and the neatness of the resulting roll really relies on the dough being a neat rectangle earlier. after which we'll flip the dough over and properly seal it with our fingers, as well as seal the edges in, tucking them in to get a nice round tip at the ends. Finally, with a sprinkle of more flour to prevent sticking, we roll the dough out to our desired length. I'm using the rolling pin as a rough goal here. It's about 20 centimeters or 8 inches long, but you can adjust these rolls as you want, making them as long or short as you'd prefer. With the bread roll properly shaped, we'll move it to its proofing spot, which is a baking tray aligned with a silicone mat. We repeat the same steps for all the other dough balls. Again, this dough can get sticky pretty quickly, especially in warm weather, so always make sure you have your scraper handy and a bowl of flour by the side. Another important thing to pay attention to is to make sure to degas all of the bubbles. This is very important to get an even crumb. If you miss out on popping a few large bubbles, they can show up and create an irregular crumb. Now, as a bit of a benefit of using this sticky dough, though, you don't have to be so cautious about lumps on the dough surface or worry about whether it's been properly sealed or not. As long as you've shaped it into a roll shape, the surface will basically smooth itself out. Now, after we're done shaping the rolls, we cover them and let the dough proof for 1 hour or until they've expanded to almost twice their original volume. While the dough proofs, make sure to set aside enough time to preheat the oven to 175 degrees Celsius. Once the proofing stage is done, we're ready to bake the dough. As a way to add a bit more shine and get a lighter color, we're going to use milk to coat the dough, as mentioned, using a silicone brush to line the dough. You could use egg wash if you'd wanted a darker color and more shine, but I find it unnecessary because even without glaze, this bread turns out pretty dark, likely due to the sugar, so using egg wash can be a bit overkill. Like I said earlier, I like using milk because it adds a bit of shine while also ensuring a lighter color. And with the glaze applied, we put the dough into the oven, baking at 175 degrees Celsius middle rack on top and bottom heat for 20 minutes. Every oven is different, so make sure to adjust these settings to your oven. If everything's gone right, you should see the bread dough springing up in the first 5 minutes of baking, like here. When the 20 minutes are up, the bread is done. We can take the bread out and savor how good it looks and smells. Make sure to move it to a wire rack to prevent a soggy bottom. At this point, I like to make the bread look even shinier by brushing it with some butter. This is entirely optional, of course, but it does make the bread look amazing and it adds a bit more richness to the taste. I'd also say it helps soften the crust. After the bread cools a little more, we can make our sandwiches. This bread really is perfect for making submarine sandwiches. It's soft and light, but at the same time, it's got enough strength to handle whatever filling you'd like to stuff it with. I made some amazing meatball subs, veggie subs, and so on. Truly a versatile sandwich bread. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!